If the universe is a hologram, as the late Stephen Hawking's final work seemed to suggest, where does it come from? And why are we in it? Gnosticism may provide alarming answers to these powerful questions. Answers that throw a very disturbing light on the biggest question there is. Why are we here? Join me in today's episode as we journey into the dark recesses of our reality, lifting the veil to catch a glimpse of what may just lie beyond. I have to be honest, the topic of today's deep dive has really thrown me into a bit of a spin. The notion of a holographic universe and what Gnosticism has to say about this has caused me to, question everything. I don't know about you, but I've always felt that there is something off with our reality, that what we experience is somehow only part of the truth. I guess that shouldn't surprise anyone coming from the guy who created a channel called Max Questions Everything. However, no matter what I think about it, let's look into this. Let's go on a reality-twisting quest to explore these unusual ideas. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. For many people, this forms the substance of how things started for us. But how and why? What were the mechanisms involved? And what was the motivation to do this in the first place? It has always intrigued me that Dr. Stephen Hawking's work in theoretical physics led him to believe there was a cosmic design behind our reality, that there was a hidden purpose in the fabric of our universe. Despite an adolescent rebellion against organized religions, I have also come to suspect that there may well be something to the biblical narrative, maybe something nearer to the biblical truth than I would have liked to suspect. Despite, or even because of this early rebellion, I have enjoyed learning about the hidden truths within the biblical text, a curiosity that has led to an alternative take on some of the stories therein. Despite, or even because of this early rebellion, I have enjoyed learning about the hidden truths within the biblical text, a curiosity that has led me to an alternative take on some of the stories therein. So let's start our journey today at the beginning, a beginning first described in the Bible and interpreted by the Gnostics. The Gnostics are a splinter movement of Christianity that was believed to have first taken root in the 1st century. They throw a very interesting light on what is generally accepted as the Bible story and the creation of humanity. Gnosticism takes much of its view of the traditional Bible story, creation, and the world we live in, from Christian texts not included in the Bible as we know it. Secret teachings that Orthodox religion has attempted to keep out of public domain for many centuries. An understanding that was kept from the narrative because it flips the story of God in the Old Testament on its head, and teachings that put way too much power and knowledge within the reach of everyday folk like you and I. Secret teachings of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, philosophies and principles that spoke directly against organized religion, encouraging mystical practices and that threatened the stability, authority, and centralized control of the established church. These texts include the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Apocryphon of John. Because of this, the threat to the proto-Catholic Church and their divergently different take on the Christian narrative, Gnostics were heavily persecuted during the 2nd millennia by the recently established Roman Catholic Church. Their complete rejection of the Old Testament and the cross did not help their cause. Gnostics see the cross as a symbol of suffering, guilt, and subjugation. Gnosticism represents a very different view of the traditional biblical story. Because of this, they were hunted, rejected, and persecuted in a tortured and executed, burning alive kind of way during the first 1,000 years or more of the Catholic Church's history. The Gnostic teachings threaten to undermine almost every aspect of Christianity as we know it. The fact they do not follow doctrines or dogmas and have no hierarchy of truth givers as Orthodox religions do seriously undermine the Church's position and its centralised power structure. Instead, the Gnostics teach a philosophy that encourages their followers to seek truth through self-realised knowledge and mystical practices, not something the established power structure in the Church were ever going to tolerate. The knowledge that so threatened the proto-Catholic Church of the time, and later their developing monastic ideologies, was the Gnostics' belief the material world had been brought into existence by the demiurge, a false god often called Yaldabaoth or Samael. Yeah, it's not hard to imagine how that might have upset a few people. This Yaldabaoth character is definitely on the flip side of the all-loving, benevolent being as portrayed by Christianity today. There is a lot to unpick here, but I'll try to summarise as best I can. The Gnostics believe the material world in which we live is an imperfect copy of prime reality created by Yaldabaoth, a copy designed to ensnare divine spirit and keep it, us, trapped from our connection to a higher divinity, from connecting with the true God, a being more akin to the idea of an interconnected creative energy, a creative divine energy that we are all simply fragmented parts of. The relevance of the divine spark's fragmented nature will become more apparent as we unpick the holographic principle later. But for now, think of cutting up a holographic picture into tiny pieces and yet finding the whole image within the individual parts, and you won't be far wrong. The Gnostics' idea of God was quite different from the obey my word kind of being portrayed in the Old Testament. The Gnostics completely reject the Old Testament, suggesting the vengeful, jealous God portrayed therein is the demiurge, a being who generated the material three-dimensional world we find ourselves within. Their view highlights a profound difference between the God of the Old Testament, with his tyrannical law, demands of blood sacrifice, and strict adherence to a set of rules, to the God described through Jesus within the New Testament. This differentiation between the God of the Old and New Testament is fundamental to Gnosticism. Fundamental as they are seen as two different entities altogether. The old God being this demiurge, Yaldabaoth, who ruled with wrath, vengeance, and jealousy, while Jesus being seen more as an entity of light, a being who broke into the material simulation to attempt to awaken humanity, divine spark, to this truth and our innate connection to a higher spiritual realm. Hello, Neo. At this point, it will probably be worth understanding the nature and motivations of this Yaldabaoth character a little deeper. Now, Yaldabaoth's beginning was not good. The Gnostics, and potentially some older religions and myths, see his jarring entry on the scene as a corruption of the divine light. Yaldabaoth was birthed by an aeon called Sophia. Aeons are supremely divine beings closely connected to divinity. But Sophia's misguided attempt to create offspring on her own, to go it alone as it were, led to Yaldabaoth's regrettable birth. Sophia was so repulsed by what she had created, she cast the demiurge out of the divine realm. In turn, Yaldabaoth's arrogance and ignorant jealousy led him to copying prime reality, generating the material world and proclaiming himself the sole god of creation. Yaldabaoth formed 12 beings known as the Archons to help him rule over this material realm, 12 demonic henchmen. Now, Yaldabaoth and his entourage of demonic archons are not in themselves believed to be particularly powerful. It is the power we hand over freely to them that works to their advantage. Yaldabaoth is often referred to as the deceiver, as manipulation and illusion are his and the archons' only real powers. They lack true creative ability and imagination, only possessing the ability to copy or imitate. However, after seeing that the world he had formed was pretty empty, and jealous of the divine spark at large in the higher realms, Yaldabaoth contrived to make some subjects of his own. Subjects he could lord it over, subjugate, and generally do his bidding, feeding him and the Archons the low vibrational energy they desired. Now, Yaldabaoth failed a fair bit in his attempts to do this, having created the first man out of clay. But it would not come to life. This frustrated him no end, but he realised it didn't possess the divine spark that would grant life. To cut a long story short, Yaldabaoth eventually stole divine spark and got his being, Adam, up and at it. Eve was created from Adam, and the rest is biblical history. If we think of the God from the Old Testament as being this Yaldabaoth character, instead of the white beardy guy smiting it down on humanity, we may just start to get a feel for why the Gnostics rejected the Old Testament. However, having created a race of beings to occupy his imperfect copy of prime reality, what Yaldabaoth did not realise was divine spark was able to awaken, was able to see through his illusionary world and ascend beyond the material existence. This awakening is the one thing Yaldabaoth and the Archons fear the most, that divine spark will realise its true identity and, recognising Yaldabaoth's ultimate powerlessness, escape the illusion of the material simulation he had devised. Gnostics see the material world of want, desire and suffering as the manifestation of Yaldabaoth's will, a world occupied with material desire, struggle and suffering, a world which the few rule over the many. The 12 Archons, or demons sent to keep this deception alive, can be seen as the archetypes of ignorance, fear, control, material desire, material attachment, authority, governance, hate, violence, illusion, and deception. When considering the Archons and the Gnostics' worldview, it is all too easy to associate the media, the fear it seems to propagate, an increasing acceptance of governments, corporations, and an elitist power structure's control over our lives, and to connect these to the archetypes at work. The struggles and challenges we face as a species and individually seem to make a little more sense when brought under the lens of this Gnostic perspective. I fully accept that for myself and the majority of people watching this episode, our lives today appear freer and are far less physically brutal than those of our ancestors. However, as much as technological, pharmaceutical and democratic development seems to support a higher standard of living, they also potentially allow for a complexity of deception to deepen. The deception alluded to by the Gnostics, that is. Future episodes exploring the connection between AI, technocracy and Yaldabaoth to follow. In the meantime, I also totally get, for most people, the notion that those who control our world may not be serving our best interests, to put it mildly, may be an unbelievable or even impossible idea to entertain, particularly at the levels of psychopathy the Gnostics describe. But stick with me here. I guess, for me at least, the difference between believing the higher echelons of our world's leadership, both on the main stage and from behind the scenes, would, could, or are deceiving the world's population in this way is simple. History. To put it bluntly, they always have. Despite history showing us this truth, distance in time seems to sell us a different belief. A belief that in the present we occupy, things are different. That they don't do that sort of thing anymore. That somehow the dynamic has shifted in our favour. But has it? Or is it simply that the mechanisms of control have evolved, become more subtle, deceptive or illusionary even? There is still a fair bit of separation and conflict at work in the world today, growing in scale if not frequency. Conflicts that now threaten our entire world. Nuclear war, germ warfare, and AI-controlled battlefields to mention but a few. And while science has delivered many securities and comforts, mind you, arguably the same could be said about war, it also brings with it the threat of catastrophes that we were once blissfully ignorant of. An awareness that, whether we realise it or not, pushes our fear and guilt buttons. Climate change, bioengineering, supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, how dangerous the rest of the universe beyond our blue little bubble actually is, apocalypses of all shapes and sizes. The list is quite endless. While all this is fascinating and describes an ever-increasing awareness of our universe, it is often very terrifying to our subconscious minds. imprinting the threats within us, whether we like it or not, to the level of our mind that cannot distinguish between apparent or real, potentially germinating an ever-present fight or flight freeze response, something that works to Yaldabaoth's advantage after all. In a world where it is difficult to see past the unrelated chaos of the latest war, conflict, political or social controversies, natural disasters or cosmic threats, it becomes near impossible to conceive of, let alone notice, a potential web of powerful and wealthy individuals threaded into some kind of demonic orchestra, pulling the strings behind the scenes. And who is pulling their strings? After all, Yaldabaoth's prime goal here is to be seen as to keep humanity in a state of ignorance, suffering and want. Everything that steers us away from connecting with divine spirit. Everything that keeps us from recognizing the interconnectedness of us all. So everything going on in the world today then. But why? Why all this misery and suffering? I mean, what is the point? Why is probably the simplest thing to understand. Apart from this being the very nature of Yaldabaoth, his motivations to drive humanity into a lesser and lesser reality, to isolate us more and more from our divine connection, is because we are seen as livestock, a source of food. Not like in a physical I'm going to eat you kind of way, although there are some pretty twisted physical rituals that could be associated with his followers. So no, not in a material kind of way, but more in an energetically parasitical kind of way. To create the all-you-can-eat buffet he desires, Yaldabaoth's mission statement, if you like, is to generate a world of suffering and ignorance. The more suffering and ignorance, the better. Every evil that man doeth, every innocence corrupted is fuel for their fires, nourishment for their black souls. Not a simple or easy view to swallow for sure, but one that does align with many of the challenges we face today. Having understood the Gnostics, their interpretation of the Bible, and the demiurge's role in their worldview a little, let's look at how these ideologies coincide with science. Along the way, answering the question, what does any of this have to do with a holographic universe? Well, quite a lot really. Now bear with me here, as this is where we step from ideology, philosophy and mysticism and into the material world. For me at least, it gets a little heavy on the science side of things at this point. But understanding how science is coinciding with Gnostic ideology may just be the key into understanding the nature of our reality as we perceive it. As already mentioned, the late Stephen Hawking's work on the Big Bang Theory steered him into conceiving we could be living in a holographic universe, and one that appears to have design. That is to say, that what we perceive as a three-dimensional physical world could be a projection from a lower two-dimensional plane. Hello, Yaldabaoth. As I discovered, the holographic principle is heavily correlated with black holes. In fact, black holes were the starting point in this idea. The idea that the three-dimensional information within a black hole is encoded on its two-dimensional surface, much like a hologram on a credit card, was a groundbreaking concept that opened the door to understanding the holographic universe at a greater level. Nothing can escape a black hole, not even light. The speed of light being seen here as a rule, a cage if you like, that is difficult to escape. The speed of light is an invisible boundary that forms an impenetrable wall around our universe, potentially part of a coding by design that prevents anything physical leaving our material reality. A growing number of mathematicians and quantum physicists suggest that at the smallest level of our reality, everything is formed from code. In much the same way the computer code drives its function. At the smallest levels, there seems to be a set of mathematical principles describing how forces and particles behave. The smaller we go when understanding the fundamental building blocks of our universe, the more it appears our universe operates under this set of predefined mathematical rules, suggesting the universe may be some kind of massive computer processing this information into the reality we perceive. Think of our brains as being part of the hardware of this cosmic computer, the biological processor decoding information into the reality we perceive. Our minds can be seen as the software decoding a signal for our brains to process, a signal embedded in the fabric of our reality. If we take the electromagnetic spectrum as the form of the holographic signal, think of the multitude of natural and man-made frequencies we are exposed to, then our reality can be thought of as being generated from a signal or set of signals, vibrations and waves, after being received by our biological and mental systems. Our five senses generate feedback. They manifest our reality through touch, taste, smell, hearing and sight into the material world we experience. Our biological and sensory components could be seen as a kind of virtual reality headset that generates the world around us. Many mystical and spiritual ideas coincide with this notion, foretelling of a kind of simulated reality where our thoughts and beliefs create our universe, what we think and believe manifesting into our experiences. Concepts, while on the New Age spectrum, that are increasingly accepted by many in the world today. Quick sidestep here. If we add to this the idea of manifestation through our belief systems and our thoughts, technological advancement can be seen as a very useful tool in Yaldabaoth's control of our perceptions and reality. A control through manipulation of the information, ideologies and views we are exposed to. But how? And what is the mechanism driving Yaldabaoth's imperfect system? Probably one of the most recognized equations in science is Einstein's famous E=mc². This equation states that energy is equal to mass multiplied by the speed of light squared, so pretty huge numbers. What this equation essentially shows us is that matter can be seen as energy stored or frozen within an object. All matter is made up of atoms. In turn, atoms are made up of particles like protons, neutrons and electrons. And these particles contain energy. A simple demonstration of this is burning wood or fossil fuels, a chemical reaction where mass is converted to energy, demonstrating that mass and energy are interchangeable. This indicates that at its most fundamental level, everything is energy. Even apparently solid, motionless objects are made up of atoms and molecules that are constantly moving or vibrating. The chair you are sitting on, the ground beneath your feet, the device you are watching this on, are made up of atoms and particles that are in constant motion, energy transformations that are always at work. Light, radio waves, microwaves, X-rays, gamma rays and cosmic waves are all forms of electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation consists of photons or particles that carry energy but have no mass. Because of this, photons don't conform to the common definition of matter. They are their own special kind of thing. Photons are essential in the energy exchanges that take place in our physical universe, and they do not seem to completely exist within it. Part of its peculiarity is that light photons exhibit wave-particle duality. Now bear with me here. What this essentially means is that they act as a wave and a particle at the same time. As a wave, the energy contained within light is proportional to its frequency, gamma rays possessing more energy than radio waves, for instance. As a particle, they interact with our physical world directly. The electromagnetic spectrum is crucial in transferring energy throughout the universe, a kind of go-between our physical reality and something else. What we perceive as different forms of matter are just different states or expressions of the same fundamental thing: energy. Matter is sometimes described by physicists as waves of energy simply slowed down until their frequency is brought to an apparent standstill. From our meat popsicle perspective anyway. Take liquids as opposed to solids. They contain motion, kinetic energy, a certain amount of movement expressing itself at a lower wave rate than the higher subatomic forms, but still higher frequencies than solids. The same can be said to be true of gases and plasmas, but at a higher state again. Solids could be seen as low energetic frequencies slowed down to a near standstill, and this frequency of waves and light, the signal, is everywhere, entwined into the very fabric of our physical universe. The electromagnetic spectrum is fundamental to the transference of all energy throughout the universe. It has been postulated that the electromagnetic spectrum is the framework on which the construction of the holographic or simulated reality exists. The source of the hologram, the signal which our biological brain and interdimensional mind decode into the physical reality we experience. A biological technology designed as a meat prism in order to contain divine spark in the material world. To put these pieces of such an elaborate deception together, it will be helpful to consider how we create our experiences in a little more depth, how this omnipresent signal is decoded into the reality we perceive and thus experiences we have. Superposition is a fundamental principle of quantum physics and important in quantum computing. In simple terms, the superposition principle states that a particle, an atom, or even a molecule can exist in many possible states at once, until it is observed or measured. When it is, it chooses a singular state to be in. Yeah, how did that happen? For example, photons act like waves when they are not observed, but when they are measured, they seem to become particles. Begging the question so far unanswered by science, how do they know the difference? This wondrous property of matter was realized through the famous double-slit experiment, an experiment that demonstrates this wave-particle duality. When unobserved, photons display wave-like behavior. When they are observed, they behave like a particle. Once the photons are measured, they are forced to become something, so they collapse into their particular state. This sent physicists spinning at the time. Einstein would have nothing to do with it. I don't blame him. I mean, how can the act of observing something, perceiving it, change its fundamental structure? Despite Einstein's uneasiness with quantum theory, it now leads the way in an ever-increasingly technological world. This concept is at the cutting edge in understanding the nature of the universe, and at the forefront of many scientific and technological advancements, suggesting, at its most basic level, the universe we perceive could be rather like the optimization of rendering in a highly sophisticated computer game. In a computer game or simulation, the rendering of what is experienced by the player does not fully take place until it is necessary. When it needs to be observed, it falls into its singular, clarified form on the screen. The matrix, driven by the game code, only takes form when the player is there to observe and interact with it, at which time the screen is transformed with a visual representation of the code. With this in mind, think of our three-dimensional reality and its rendering in terms of our brain-mind as the computer and operating system processing the signal through our 5 physical senses, creating the sensory reality we experience, and we might just be getting to the crux of the mechanism that could be at work. Add to this the innate ability of divine spark, us humans, to manifest into reality what we think and believe, and we may begin to understand how perceptual control over our thoughts, feelings, and belief systems become a powerful tool in the hands of those who might wish to control them. But the idea that we are individual biological computers decoding a set of electromagnetic signals, frequency and vibrational waves, pretty much describes how we interact with the world around us today anyway. But even as stretched as this overall concept may first appear, it is the greatest thinkers in the world who identified these elements that can be pieced together in order to create this mind-bending idea about our reality. A mind-bending idea that slips neatly into the Gnostics' overall take of the material world. An idea that may just bring into clarity the very workings of our existence, answering the question, why are we here? Even the likes of Elon Musk and Neil deGrasse Tyson strongly argue that the chances of us living in a base reality are billions to one against. That is to say, we are in a simulation already. Their reasoning behind this? As technology progresses, we will soon be able to create simulations indistinguishable from reality, suggesting we may already be within one, and if we are, we would not be able to tell. Think AI, quantum computing, and biological interfaces, and we can already see the possibilities taking place in our world today. So what we end up with is a reality where we are in the driving seat, albeit without truly realizing it, and a mechanism of control and deception through an ever-increasing manipulation of the information we receive. A mechanism steering us toward good old Yaldabaoth's world of suffering and ignorance. Consider social media, the news, Hollywood, politics, in fact just about every line of information into our brains there is, and we may be able to see what guides the rendering of our experiences, albeit subconsciously, feeding the architects of this realm with just what they desire. But if any of this worries you, don't let it. Apart from worry being part of the game plan on their part, there is a solution to this. A very simple solution that I will discuss in a future episode on how reincarnation and a few other things fit into this model. But for now, remember, you are in the driving seat and can consciously control where you go. So that's the science bit over, with a good pinch of creative connection building on my part, admittedly. But this is a story, a concept I have long wanted to express, one that has been building in me for well over a year. And you made it through the mysticism, the science, and some imaginative leaps on my part. So thanks for sticking with me. We have come a long way in this episode, covered a lot of ground, from the science behind the holographic principle to superposition and the rendering of our realities we perceive, from the Gnostic interpretation of why this may be occurring, to the motivations behind those who may be orchestrating the reality we experience. But is any of it real? Does the description on the workings of our world I have creatively pieced together truly represent our reality? Well, I'll leave you to decide that for yourself, but I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for sticking with me on this absolutely mind-boggling episode. If you made it this far, then you definitely deserve a medal. It is early days for me on this one-man show I call Max Questions Everything. Your support in helping this channel grow is genuinely valued and most definitely appreciated. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to see more, then please consider hitting the like button. If you'd like to be kept informed of new episodes as they are released, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I look forward to seeing you again soon as we continue on our adventures into the unknown, the unsettling, and the utterly bizarre. In the meantime, question everything.